This week marked World Water Week, a period dedicated to discourses around water cooperation, peace and security. Over the years, many South African communities continue to fail to access this basic service. The Water Services Act outlines that everyone has a right to access basic water supply and sanitation. Is there any legal recourse for residents whose rights in this regard are violated by the lack of water provision? We get perspective from the lawyer at the Center of Environmental Rights, Adelaide Chagopa, who joins us now on the line. Adelaide, good morning. Thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, Ms. Chama. Thanks for inviting me.
Firstly, how does your work at the Center for Environmental Rights intersect with the issue of water infrastructure, vandalism, and human right to water?
The work at the center, although it does not focus primarily on water, we work more on strategic water sources. That's to protect the actual source of water. And then other partner organizations deal with issues most tied towards service, which includes infrastructure as well as vandalism. However, in my own personal capacity, through my research, my postgraduate studies, I tackle issues of water service delivery, which deals with infrastructure development, as well as the idea of resilient water systems.
And can you discuss any collaboration or partnerships you've worked on with government agencies or civil society organizations or even local communities to address the water infrastructure challenges?
Not with the center, but in my research, I worked to highlight the plight of the residents in Hammanskraal, particularly when compared to the levels of access to water that Tshwane as a metropolitan has. Comparatively, Hammanskraal is decades behind. So I have not worked with a government agency necessarily, but I have engaged with the South African Human Rights Commission, as well as just interviews with some of the residents.
All right. When you say Hammanskraal is decades behind, what does the law say about water provision in South Africa specifically?
Well, the law in South Africa is very clear. Water is a right. So specifically, access to sufficient water is the right. And what that means is that everyone should have some form of access, and that access has a prescribed minimum standard. I heard in your introduction, you mentioned the Water Services Act, which speaks on basic water supply. And that means everybody is entitled to at least 25 liters per person per day of potable water. Many people across South Africa do not receive this bare minimum. In fact, some have never received more than perhaps 10, 5, or even just 2 liters of water a day.
And is there any legal recourse for those who are essentially deprived of that basic human right?
Yes. At the center, we focus a lot on advocacy work. So the first step in this process we would advise is that you speak to your municipal manager, lodge a complaint. And when that doesn't work, escalate to the provincial department, citing specifically Section 63 of the Water Services Act, which compels them to intervene in a space where the municipality is failing to provide basic services. When all that fails, then the next legal step is naturally litigation, much in the same vein as the Mazabuku case.
And what has been your assessment of the impact of vandalism on water infrastructure in South Africa?
It is massively negatively impacts water infrastructure. But what's also important to note is that the infrastructure in and of itself is quite old and is outdated and simply cannot stand up to the levels of access that are required, especially since South Africa's population continues to boom.
All right, so let's talk about how these syndicates are able to even infiltrate or manipulate the water supply system in the first place where vandalism is concerned.
Very interesting. I think it really is a matter where our system is old, the infrastructure is old, and is not as secure as what it could possibly be and what it could potentially be. And partly what vandals do is they take critical metal that's involved in the piping system, And what we could do is change materials to something more not only sustainable, but also of lesser value to these vandals, which would result in less disruptions in this access for residents.
And to what extent are corruption and bribery significant factors in allowing the water tanker mafias to operate and profit from their activities?
I think there's a massive element of criminality there with corruption. I think when considering that question, though, it's important to note that the reason why we have the water tankers is because some areas do not have any connection to the water grid, where once we establish what connection and access to water looks like, where it excludes provision of water through water tankers, then we can begin to address and narrow the influence of criminality. Importantly, though, is that the water tanker mafia relies upon South Africa being unable to service every single person correctly. So if we eliminate that element, then there will be no recourse for them in terms of criminality. But also is the threat that privatization has on access to water, because municipalities often then discharge this duty, like the water tankers' duty to provide water, to third parties. And that also opens space up for corruption and criminality.
And Adelaide, how do you think the government and municipalities can better address the issue of vandalism and hold those responsible accountable?
So interestingly enough, how government could address this is to start by, again, as there are efforts to update our system, is to look at alternative materials, alternative ways to supply water. It's important to consider how we can change what is the value of the items that are being vandalized, and how can we change that to make it seem less valuable, but ultimately it is of course of value because it's how we get our water. And importantly is to ensure that our police services are working when we do catch the vandals, that they are prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And that requires a lot of cooperation between the municipality, police services, as well as the department.
And how do you think South Africa's legal framework can be strengthened to better protect the right to water and to hold perpetrators of vandalism accountable?
I think South Africa's legal framework can be improved. And at the moment, we do have the Water Services Amendment Bill, which in terms of access to water seeks to create an enforcement mechanism which the minister can use to ensure that municipalities do provide water and access to water. What isn't fully there, I think, is the penalties. Penalties are not as harsh or as strong as they could potentially be to act as a deterrent, because for some of these mafias, there is so much money involved that to pay an administrative fine or to go to prison for a little bit is worth the risk. So to make the fines as strong as possible, to make the consequences as strong as possible in the penal section of the law would be greatly helpful.
And Adelaide, what are the next steps that your organization will take to address the water crises and advocate for the rights of marginalized communities?
So in our work, we take a broader focus, and that focus in particular is on climate justice. And this idea of climate justice is that it is tied into every single right. And currently, South Africa's water systems are severely impacted by climate change. So once we work towards the idea of sustainable cities, the idea of sustainable water infrastructure, that is what we advocate for, is for big, larger changes of the entire framework and system to make it more resilient and as well as to make it more accessible for people, because justice also means access to people, to water for people. However, in discussing what access means and thinking about it from a sustainability and climate justice perspective is to start to think beyond the traditional methods of water supply, is to start to think, is piping the best possible way to supply water to people in certain parts of the country? Or is it something more innovative? Is it water storage rather? Is it a system that uses, rainwater collection or water collection? I think those are questions that need to be asked, but importantly, when asking these questions is to consider how we are spending the money allocated for water infrastructure development, because it starts at infrastructure in order to enable people to have access to water.
All right, Adelaide, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
All right, that was human rights lawyer at the Center for Environmental Rights, Adelaide Chagopa.